Mr. Commissioner, you recall when we started with this panel, I didn't have a redacted copy of Mr. Staley's CV, which we now have, and we had flagged Exhibit 401 for this CV, so if that could be now officially marked, that would be appreciated.
So marked.
Thank you. All right, just before we broke, we were talking about the TAM rule and the 60% ceiling, and I don't want to talk about that particular piece anymore, but I do want to talk about the TAM rules and ask you a question around their appropriateness of TAM rules being developed for each run timing group. Right now, the way the FRSSI model is run and the way the IMFP is developed, there is a TAM rule, TAM harvest rule, developed for each run timing group, which, as we know, is an aggregate in many cases of various stocks. So my question is that the right way to make management decisions? Should the TAM rules be formulated for the run timing groups as we know them, or should they be created for a finer resolution, perhaps on a different aggregation of stocks or a CU level, or should all of the stocks be run together and a rule be developed, one rule for all of the stocks in the system? So I'll start with you, Mr. Morley.
Well, Mr. Commissioner, I think that with the extent of overlap between the run timing groups, that it is difficult having a separate TAM rule for each of the 4 run timing groups. I know that some of my colleagues here are going to suggest that we should be looking at separate run timing rules for each of the individual conservation units, and I'll let them speak to that. I don't think that's at all practical if you want to have any kind of fishery in a mixed area, which is where 95% of the fisheries, First Nations and recreational and commercial take place currently. And but I do think that we could in fact look at simplifying things a little bit, because although early stewards are probably reasonably separated from the other run timing groups, the extent of overlap between early summers, and lates has in many cases been increasing in recent years, and it makes it very difficult to operate separate TAM rules for each of them, and that we could perhaps look more at TAM rules that would apply to time periods rather than run timing groups. That if you wanted to fine tune it a little bit, you could have one that operated for a 2 or 3 week period, then change it for the next 2 or 3 weeks, and then change it for the next 2 or 3 weeks. But that could identify some of the issues between the different stocks. But I don't think that having that the current problems with the overlap is causing us to lose some production in terms of yield for all the fisheries, and really when we are not creating any significant conservation problems for the ones whose run timing rule at that time period is ruling the day in terms of managing the fishery. So I do think that we could simplify it a little bit more from where we currently are and have something that would meet conservation goals as well, but provide for better opportunities for yield.
Mr. Staley? I'm
not as certain as Mr. Morley is about what the appropriate aggregation, disaggregation should be. To date, I don't believe there's been, although there's been a lot of sensitivity analysis done, I don't think the model's been actually challenged, or the process has been challenged with exploring all the various combinations and permutations of aggregation and disaggregation yet. That being said, I don't think, the FRSSI, the calculation framework that's in the model right now only has the capacity to deal with one fishery at one time per year, and so it by design, I guess, reflects a single mixed stock area. There's been attempts to try and disaggregate a little bit by having some approximations to overlapping timing represented on the annual time step, but they're only sort of approximations. So I guess I'm not certain at this point. I don't think I can answer that question with one way or the other. I suspect that there is value, certainly from the conservation side of things, and probably if there were to consider having the types and locations of some of the fisheries that are represented in the model changed, so add more fisheries and so on. There might be some utility in exploring a more disaggregated set of management groups. One of the other issues with the current set of management groups we have is that they were established when with a certain set of assumptions about timing and distribution, and either that timing and distribution has changed in reality, or our ability to observe it has changed. Certainly, our ability to observe it has changed in the sense that we're now using DNA as a stock identification tool as opposed to the scales that were used prior to, I guess, the turn of this century, and the consequence of that is that I think there's probably room, whether there should be 4 or not, there's probably the current set of 4 may not be the most appropriate set of 4. There are stocks within some of the current management groups that are quite separate from the other members of that group in both timing and geography. So I think some more work needs to be done on that, and I guess at the end of it, I can't answer the question one way or another without doing that more work.
When you said that right now the model only can deal with one single mixed stock fishery at one time, do you mean, are you describing one run timing group at one time? Is that what you're indicating?
Whatever the aggregation is
Yep.
only fished. It's fished together with all the other members of that aggregation,
Right.
in the model construct.
So there's not a concept of having them overlap, or the model can't run the overlap effectively. Is that what you're saying?
Well, as I say, there's been an attempt to approximate the overlaps, and it doesn't represent the sort of the richness of the decision making that can go on in season to try and separate stocks. Or the information that challenges people in season. So while it may be a useful sort of guide or indicator, it's not going to, really get at what the costs and benefits are of various aggregations and disaggregations. There needs to be some more detailed work on an in-season basis, and trying to replicate that in season over the many seasons that this longer-term view has to accommodate, and that's work in progress as far as I can see.
And just one final question for you on this. If the models were run down to a very small, fine level, like the level of CUs, for example, would you have the same problem that those CUs are not running independently? They're running in a mixed stock run all the time. So would you continue to have this problem of knowing what stocks, or what the impacts are of stocks running together at the same time?
Well, I'm not sure if you're talking about the modeled world or the real world.
I'm talking about if the model could be run not for an aggregate but for an individual CU or an individual stock, I take it you would still run into this problem of not being able to understand the overlap of that stock or CU with other stocks it runs with at the same time.
You wouldn't be able to replicate it completely. You could certainly scope out or expose the regions of where there may be some advantages to complete disaggregation, and where there's no difference if they are aggregated from a management perspective in terms of the performance and conservation performance, yield performance, catch performance measures that Mr. Cass talked about earlier. You'd want to look at the response of those to the sum of the responses of the individual groups as compared to the response of the aggregate to those groups, and see if there's a big difference. Then it's important to disaggregate. Right. If there's not a big difference, then it's not so important.
All right, Mr. Wilson.
I agree with Mike's comments, Mr. Stady's comments. My concern is that within the modeled world, a fishery takes the same proportion of each of the constituent stocks. But in the real world, that's not the case. And as you correctly point out, it's not the case because the timing of migration and other behavior characteristics in the location of fisheries can cause the harvest of a higher proportion of one stock than another, even though they're part of the same timing aggregate. And that places the stocks that are less abundant, in my view, at risk.
Mr. Cass?
I guess the only thing I have to add from what's already been said is, Mr. Commissioner, to disaggregate them all down to the CU level. And you may want to check with the Salmon Commission staff on this, but from an in-season management point of view, the resolution on some of these small stocks where there's an assumed large number of them, or at least management is focusing on all the stocks independently, that the stock ID error, as I said before, is something that needs to be considered. So there's so that's an example of some practical issues that you need to take into account. But I thought the issue was. I agree with my colleagues here.
What about modeling, instead of having the 4 aggregates, all of the stocks together in one big aggregate? Is that
one
possible?
TAM rule?
Yeah.
One TAM rule that covers all stocks. Yeah, not been tried that I'm aware of. That it becomes a harder problem in trying to then post-season, if you like, evaluate how well you've met your escapement targets, because those are CU based, and so one TAM rule to fit all. I'm assuming now, without having done the work, and I agree with Mike that this is an area of that could be explored. This issue of timing and how much the information can actually help you. What data do we actually have? Needs more work. Yeah, I think the work needs to be done. I think the trying to manage to a single TAM rule is the resolution there to do that. I couldn't answer that question.
Mr. Morley, you touched in your answer on some of the practical issues in managing to a selective CU harvest. Could you elaborate? Did you think that is a practical? Is it possible to manage to a CU level?
Well, taking into account two things that. One that Mr. Cass just went through, which is the question of being able to differentiate individual CUs when you're in certain areas, given that some of these are so small that in test fisheries or in any kind of data generation sampling, that you're unlikely to find a representative enough size of sample to, in fact, find out what you've got in many of the individual CUs, and put that together with where most of our fisheries currently are. I think that would mean that if that was your objective, to set a TAM rule for each of the CUs, and that you wanted to manage to that would mean that you would have to do it in a place where you could identify the individual harvests and distinguish them enough, which in my opinion would be when they were essentially separated from each other, given some of these small CUs. So you would have to only implement that rule when you could find them separate, which would be when the fish were on their natal stream spawning grounds. So that the only fisheries that you could manage under that regime would be ones where in fact you were fishing when the fish were completely separate on the spawning grounds. We don't really have any fisheries that match that at the current time to any great degree. And so you would be basically shutting down all of the fisheries in Johnson Straits, the lower river, in Stolo area, in fact, until you got essentially onto the individual stream spawning grounds.
And have you thought about whether there are any risk management issues which arise comparing a mixed stock in the marine environment to a selective CU harvest in the river?
The selective CU harvest is, again, we would be developing a number of very new fisheries. Presumably, if you wanted to take advantage of the full yield, they would, in some cases, would have to be fairly large fisheries. So you would have to have a whole new slew of assessment programs to evaluate the run sizes in those areas, because right now we do not do in-season run size evaluation for each of the individual populations. We wait until we see how many fish have spawned, and we do an assessment of how many fish we saw on the spawning grounds to determine how many there are in each of those individual CUs. And we do run reconstruction based on sampling at the catches to make up the rest of it. If you wanted to manage fisheries on each of those CUs, you would have to do in-season run size assessments in each of those areas, and that are brand new programs that would be very expensive to implement and would have, certainly in the initial years, a very high degree of uncertainty and a high degree of risk as to what actual levels of population you were measuring.
There's something which has been called stationarity, and I might have this wrong, but perhaps you could just confirm for Mr. Wilson, is stationary the concept that historical data can be used to predict the future, so that we sort of look at the past and say that the assumptions that we can draw from analyzing past data will be consistent and valid assumptions moving into the future? Is that a fair?
I think you've captured the essence of it.
Okay.
But for the most part, our concern is around productivity and how productivity changes over time. These models actually assume that productivity is in some way stable, because you have to make some assumptions about the relationship between past data and the likely outcome of things in the future if you're going to evaluate alternative policy. The concern, of course, is that when we look at Fraser Sockeye, or any other biological system for that matter, stationarity is hard to find. The world isn't a stable place, and in many areas it's quite chaotic. And although you can fit a model to historical data, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be reliably predicting the future. And that's a fundamental issue that we haven't, I don't think, adequately addressed, Kalman filters or not. Trying to track changing productivity, particularly if there's a time trend through the course of your data where productivity is in relatively constant decline for some time period, you're left with the problem of what's going to happen if the trend continues. Will the trend break? At what level will productivity recover to, and how long will it stay there? And those are all questions that you have to have answers for if you're going to run the model 48 years into the future. And I don't believe we have answers for those things, and it causes me to fundamentally question whether maximum sustainable yield is anything more than a theory.
Mr. Cass, what's your response to that? First of all, do you agree that the past productivity is an assumption of future productivity in the FRSSI model, and if so, is that a reasonable assumption to make?
Well, I mean, as Ken pointed out, Mr. Commissioner, the world is non-stationary. As we know, things change. They change to varying degrees. The difficulty is, of course, in predicting what long-term, let alone the short-term. And the approach that's been taken is to go down the track of, as Ken mentioned, Kalman filter, which is a way to track productivity over time, but it's tracking productivity that we've already seen. And so the notion is that, okay, if we are in a period of productivity that differs a fair amount from the overall historical trend, then perhaps we could use that tool or other tools that identify or estimate productivity for a more recent period, and then use that as one scenario, if you like, to project forward into the future. And of course, that's a way to hedge or against low productivity continuing into the future, is to use a period of productivity in history to give you some bounds about what you think or some plausible scenarios that might play out in terms of future productivity changes. But as I think I heard Ken say, even accounting for what you might think are plausible changes for future productivity based on historical information, we don't know how future productivity is going to play out. So all you can do is create scenarios. What we've done anyway is create scenarios that we are hoping would bound future productivity changes, and then assess based on a model like this what's the impact, or how rigorous or how sensitive are those future scenario productivity changes. How sensitive is in this case a TAM rule, or is there a TAM rule that's robust to what we think are the reasonable ranges of productivity in the future? So it's a difficult challenge to do that, but we have come from a period where we have assumed the entire 50 years of historical data on Fraser Sockeye are likely representative of future outcomes. We have come from that particular base case scenario, if you like, which has been applied, to a lot of thinking around now about how do we create scenarios, future scenarios that account for changing in productivity in ways that that might bound it, or at least some characteristic trends that we might see. So that's a hot area, not just in this FRSSI world, a hot area in more directly, I guess, in forecasting. So there's been, and also in the work being done on WSP benchmarks, where benchmarks themselves are linked to future states of productivity, future states of nature, because they're linked to, Ken mentioned SMSY, they're linked to where we are, what's the state relative to, say, a healthy population. And so that state may change over time. So the benchmarks and those indicators that measure healthy populations are in fact changing. So it's an area of interest and research, but it's very challenging to predict the future. The only thing we really can do, I think, is evaluate TAM rules to look for rules that are more or less robust to the way we think things might play out in the future. So,
Mr. Morley, do you have anything to add to that?
The only thing I have to add is that if in fact we assume in the modeling here that the productivity is higher in the future than it turns out to be, that what that does through the course of this modeling is to allow us, or in fact lead us in the direction that would put the benchmarks higher than they would be in the low productivity scenario. So in fact, the TAM rule and the modeling process results in a situation where if you think it's going to be more productive, then you're willing to put more fish on the spawning grounds because you're going to get more back from it. But if it turns out to be less productive and the run comes in lower, the TAM rule is such that you in fact harvest at a much lower rate. So the kind of feedback mechanism that we're talking about and robust rules is built into this model to a certain extent already, in the sense that if the productivity ends up being lower, we actually are going to be harvesting under these TAM rules that we're developing now at a lower rate than if we had developed TAM rules with a lower projected productivity expectation. So there's some built-in conservatism already in the way these rules are constructed that deals with a significant part of the concern that Mr. Wilson has identified.
Mr. Staley?
I'd like to think of it not as much are we trying to predict the future, that we're trying to find control rule or policies or TAM rules which are more robust to whatever future we might face. And by robust, in this case, we'd mean of a set of alternative TAM rules, does the sort of rank order of those TAM rules is almost independent of what the future might bring. That would be a very robust TAM rule if it was the best one no matter what happened. And so that's the search that we really are under, not the search to be able to predict the future better or worse, but to be able to find a set of actions that we can put in place that can be responsive to and be the best set of actions, or the better of the worst, I guess, regardless of whether we're in a productivity regime that's growing or shrinking or staying the same. To the extent to which the current model and the use of it to date has been successful at that, I think it's a modest success. Some of the things Mr. Morley raised are appropriate. It's there's a fair amount of conservatism in the TAM rules we have that have been in play for the last cycle of salmon than there were for several decades in the latter part of last century. And so we've at least if we've made an error, we've erred a little more towards the conservative side than we might have otherwise been. But I think our search is for the rule that will be the best rule no matter what the future is, not to be able to predict the future with any more accuracy than anybody else can.
Can I just ask a question, just following up on that? I'm not sure I can articulate this adequately, and I apologize for that in advance, but in the binder I have, it probably appears in other places, but at tab 1, again, I apologize, Ms. Baker, I'm not sure what the exhibit number is for that.
It's 396.
396. It's on page 1, Mr. Lunn. I think it's under introduction. Maybe I'll try and make this, for me at least, as simple as I can to ask you this. For each stock and stock aggregate, what are the optimal harvest rules given different management objectives and assumptions about population dynamics? Just so I have some understanding where each of you are coming from when you answer the questions of Ms. Baker, are you all on the same page about what is an optimal harvest rule? In other words, in the weighting of your answers, are some of you coming at it from more of a conservation perspective than others? Are you giving the same weight when you answer these questions to conservation versus harvest? Because I don't know what, maybe there's a definition section in this document which says what an optimal harvest rule is, but I'm not sure after hearing some of your answers that I really understand what an optimal harvest rule is.
Yeah, optimal, and I think you're right to point out, optimal is different in different people's views. Optimal is only optimal given a set of conditions. So if the history of the numbers of spawners and the subsequent recruitment from that are in the, say, the green zone, to use the WSP vernacular, then optimal might mean to maintain a harvest rate that keeps the population in that zone. But there may be optimal in the sense of optimal to account for or to hedge or provide a buffer against some of the knowledge gaps, such as unproductive or stocks that aren't in the model and are unproductive. Optimal in the sense that we don't quite we know that estimates in season of run size are uncertain, so what's optimal to guard against errors associated with uncertainty in run size, or optimal in the sense of given errors in the ability to, even if we knew run size perfectly, to as it's been explained by some, to be able to hit the bullseye, even though we know what the harvest rate should be, given perfect information, that there's going to be errors in the way we implement the harvest of a stock. So optimal is can be relative terms. It is used in fisheries science and many times to mean that it is the harvest rate that maximizes the long-term sustainability of the population, and so in the FRSSI world, we have a 60% harvest cap, and it's as I mentioned, it's designed because of some of the knowledge gaps in related to the number of stocks that we use in the model, uncertainty in run size, uncertainty in able to hit the actual harvest rate that we are trying to make. And so that's the sort of the classic use of optimal. In the FRSSI world, though, because we are developing a TAM rule that is conditioned on performance indicators, the performance of avoiding low populations with some frequency, the avoidance of falling below catch with some frequency, and potentially the ability to stabilize catch. So optimal in those senses could mean different things. So I don't know, I've gone on enough. I suppose I'm just trying to categorize what optimal is under certain circumstances, and certainly optimal changes with changing productivity over time. So if you're in a long-term low regime, that is going to be the optimal for that particular regime. Could be different and would be different than for a stock that's in some other regime, to use the word. So it needs to be probably better described, I guess, than what's in here, maybe.
Mr. Commissioner, I guess in going back to your more direct question in terms of different values between different people, I certainly believe that to be the case. And aside from all the technical aspects of optimal that Dr. Cass has identified, certainly the key item in that phrase, from my point of view, is what your management objectives are. And certainly your definition of optimal might be different between Mr. Wilson and myself. Mr. Wilson may, not putting words in his mouth, be more concerned about preserving every one of the conservation units in it and the genetic diversity in terms of his view of sustainability, whereas I, from coming my perspective as a user of the resource, might be more concerned about a balance between long-term sustainability of the total population and also trying to find some way to maximize yield over time. So that would be, in terms of optimal in the context here, I think, was trying to balance both those kinds of objectives in determining what an optimal TAM rule might be.
Did you want to add something, Mr. Wilson?
Yes. I agree. We all bring different values to this table, and those values will change the way we view the optimum solution. If you believe that conservation is our primary obligation and that each and every CU needs to be conserved, you'll take a different approach than if your primary obligation is to sustain a commercial fishery. As I understand it, we have a clear commitment to conservation under the wild salmon policy. We need to address that obligation. We have obligations to First Nations, which are not necessarily adequately addressed within the context of the FRSSI model, since stocks from large geographic areas can all decline at the same time. We can still meet our escapement goals, but we're not fundamentally honoring our commitment. Those values all need to be expressed and addressed in the process of setting TAM rules for stocks and aggregates. And it's my concern that they're not. So I think it's absolutely true that we bring different values to the table depending on where we're at. Most of the people at the table harvest fish. That's what they do. If you don't harvest fish, then your optimum solution might be quite different because you'll value other things. You'll value the opportunity to go look at the spawning grounds full of fish on the Shuswap, or you'll value First Nations catches in remote areas of the watershed. And different TAM rules will accomplish those objectives to a different degree, and we'll weight the solution in different ways.
Mr. Staley, I think you're the only one who hasn't had a kick at this can.
Yeah, I guess so. Yes, I agree with Mr. Morley and Mr. Wilson that we all have different values in this. I think, but this is question and this discussion is more instructive about what Mr. Cass set out as this morning was discussed as the two components of the FRSSI. One is basically a machinery that tries to replicate the best we can what the natural world may or may not do, and the other is how to gather the people that are going to be affected by that and articulate their interests and try and balance their interests. And so in that context, I think the optimal harvest rules, given the different management objectives, are exactly those different management objectives you just heard between Mr. Wilson and Mr. Morley and others, and but balance those against the various kinds of possible population dynamics that are out there, and try and find a set of responses and management controls that both maximize those are optimal in a sense that they maximize the some weighted aggregate of the values. And the FRSSI process, we heard about some workshops earlier this morning. Some of those workshops were explicitly there to try and quantify some of those weights and trade-offs. And how successful that is I think still for a matter of discussion review. But you were quite right that those of us at this table probably all have different weights that we put on the conservation piece as if we put on the catch piece, albeit that the catch and conservation are intertwined.
I think I was going to ask some questions about this area, and I think maybe I'll just move ahead to those now. It touches on some submissions that we have heard at public forums as well, so I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the trade-offs that have to be made, and I think that's another way of talking about the balancing of interests that we've just been discussing. I take it everybody would agree that as part of the planning process, it's important to consider where those trade-offs are made between biodiversity or conservation and sustainable fisheries. That seems to be a given. Is there anybody, I guess, who disagrees that that's an important part of the planning process? Nobody's speaking up, so I'll take that as an agreement with me. So the FRSSI model, as I understand it, has been designed to allow for some explicit discussions on those trade-offs and that happens in different venues, such as the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, meetings with groups, and just an interpretation of the options that are set out by the FRSSI model. How should decision makers be making those trade-offs? Ultimately, it's the department who produces an integrated fisheries management plan. How should the department or decision makers evaluate and make those trade-offs? And I'll start with you, Mr. Morley.
Well, I think that the department needs to be much more explicit in terms of doing some evaluation of, as much as they can, the financial costs and benefits, as well as the social implications of the various management scenarios that are available to them. And frankly, the process that has been undertaken in terms of FRSSI on this issue, I think, has been very deficient and is not very good at any of those things. And if you could perhaps bring up Exhibit 322, page 15 again, I can kind of go through an example here and explain. It was what Dr. Cass was on this morning, and those two graphs that are on that page. Because the process that was been described in the FRSSI process was that you get a bunch of stakeholders in a room, and the modelers here have tried to develop some kind of objective function that they can plug into this model that will sort of solve the equation for this social trade-off based on people sort of a group of people in a room defining their preferences, okay? And that's resulted in this kind of a table, and you got sort of the ignore option 1 on the bottom there because it's kind of a non-option because it's not evaluated at the top. But if you look at options 2, 3, and 4, they describe very different TAM rules that have come out of this process. And the performance indicators that the model has used based on this surveying of people, there's 3 lines graphed above. The bottom dotted line is the probability of the 4-year average level of spawners being lower than some lower benchmark. And the second line up is the probability that the is that individual year, Mike? Any individual year is lower than that lower benchmark. And then the top line is this so-called probability of whether or not the catch is lower than the low benchmark, okay? Sort of a low catch benchmark as being sort of the evaluation from a catch or yield point of view. Okay? My problem with the way it's done in this process is that the interesting thing here is that, number one, that option 2, 3, and 4 perform almost identically on the 2 so-called conservation objectives. There's no difference in those options between them in terms of significant difference as to probabilities on this evaluation. There's a very small change in the low catch one. Okay, it does in fact, if you got a higher spawning goal like in option 4 and you're cutting back your harvest at lower levels of run sizes to achieve that, then clearly you're going to catch a little bit less from time to time. But none of those evaluations really look at what happens in season. So we're making a decision on option 2, 3, and 4 based on that kind of input. But if you look at what might happen in season, there's a huge differential between choosing these options. If you go down to the bottom graph, if we had decided as a group that option 4 was what we wanted to take, and if the run size came at 200,000, you, under the TAM rule, your total allowable mortality would be somewhere in the range of 20%. But if you had chosen option 2, your TAM rule would be 60%. So if the run size on this particular run, and we're just using early Stewart as an example here, but if, then you're talking about at a 200,000 run size, the difference between potentially harvesting 140,000 or 120,000 or harvesting only 40,000. And that the value of that in terms of all the harvesters, in this case, they're given the allocation framework for early Stewart. These would be all First Nations harvesters. There'd be no commercial harvest on this at all. And yet we're in a situation where the FRSSI process has basically said there's no difference between these options. And yet, I think when you look at in season as the decision to be made here, there's a huge difference in social benefits to a large group of people. And yet, going through the FRSSI process, it leads you, I mean, we can't make that decision. And the actual evaluation of what you're achieving in terms of harvesting at those different rates in season needs to be looked at. What are the values and incomes to First Nations fishers in Johnson Straits, to gillnetters in the Lower River, to First Nations economic opportunity fisheries in the river, to First Nations very important social FSC fisheries all the way up the river. That evaluation is not done in the context of analyzing these escapement goals. And once we set these rules, currently they have been extremely inflexible in season, so we're stuck with them. And so I just think that the kind of economic evaluation that lays out these numbers in dollars and cents, in benefits to people, has got to be done more explicitly and in the discussion and evaluated, and not just someone going into a room and putting a little tick beside a box so that a modeler can develop an objective function, which is essentially what has been done so far.
How would you see that kind of socioeconomic analysis being done?
Well, first of all, you've got to include economists in the process, and they don't do that currently. The department has got a seriously lack of in-house people who can actually do this work and do the evaluation. You have to actually go out and find out what incomes people are making in the fishery, what additional catch means to their income and means to the communities they live in, and that kind of economic analysis of what's going on in the fishery, again, has not been done for many, many years.
Do you think that the people who participate in the IHPC or the different harvest sectors that meet individually with the department can provide enough information on those fronts?
The people who go there can provide their personal point of view, but what we need, in addition to the information they provide, is a professional evaluation from a socioeconomic perspective, someone who can go out and, as far as possible, boil these things down into, for example, a Treasury Board cost-benefit analysis that would be to acceptable professional standards, as well as bringing in some of the environmental variables that you can actually quantify some of those and look at the scenarios and say, if we adopt option 3, for example, we can anticipate this level of income and this level of environmental benefit and this level of social benefit. If we adopt option 2, then you get this level of income, this level of each of the other attributes we're looking for, and compare those results in a quantified sense, not just using stakeholders' opinions, and not just a popularity contest or a political issue, but something that's done, evaluated on a more consistent technical basis from year to year.
If you could turn to tab 2 of the binder before you, this is CAN 002915. This is a draft, a framework for socioeconomic analysis to inform integrated fisheries management planning and fish harvest decisions. Have you seen this document before? Oops.
The first time I came to see it was, in fact, when I was reviewing documents as part of this commission. I didn't know it existed until I saw that.
Right, so has this been brought to your attention in any of the planning work that you've done with the department?
No, it hasn't.
And have you reviewed this document?
I have looked at the document, yes, and I think it's an excellent start in looking at some of the things the department should be doing when in our both objective setting process in terms of spawning objectives, as well as evaluating different management plan alternatives, for sure. If they implemented this in a professional way, it would go a long ways to deal with some of the issues that I've been raising.
Could I have this marked, please, as the next exhibit?
Exhibit 403.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, can I ask you, I know that the question probably is a long time ago now, but the question was something along the lines of how should policymakers or decision makers, be making trade-offs and making the decisions with respect to trade-offs between economic interests and conservation interests and any other interests that, such as First Nation interests, I suppose, that you brought forward.
how should they? Well, it seems to me that the way we've framed the problem is, an attempt to maximize the economic benefits while we minimize the biological harm. So we're trying to harvest the abundance from strong stocks while we protect the weaker stocks as much as we can. But in many respects, that sets us up for almost a lose-lose situation. So we're making trade-offs that compromise the biological health of the resource in some cases, and we're doing that in order to achieve economic benefits, or social benefits, or some other set of benefits. Buzz Halling put it another way. He said that really we should be looking for golden rule management. In other words, you do what's best for the fish in the hopes that over the long term, what's best for the fish will also lead to the best stream of benefits for those that rely on fish for harvest. We certainly need to be explicit about the values that are on the table and how we're going to weigh those values in making this compromise.
Mr. Staley, have you got anything to add on this topic?
I just, from my experience working with First Nations, I would like to offer that that to date, at least, the approach to trying to gather and inform itself of the values and the whatever trade-offs, if that's a concept that's the trade-off concept is somewhat difficult for many First Nations to absorb, but that I don't think it's done a really good job of it, I guess, to put it bluntly. One of the reasons is that within and among the First Nations, there's a vast divergence and diversity of interests and values, particularly when it comes to Fraser Sockeye. And I haven't seen to date a place that, and a process that grapples with that diversity and represents it well enough to be balanced, if that's an appropriate approach with the other interests.
And Mr. Cassidy, what do you say to the criticism that the model doesn't adequately address doesn't adequately allow for trade-offs between socioeconomic interests and conservation interests?
Well, I certainly would accept the idea that if the model does not match the reality of the world, that is what are the important economic factors that the model does currently not entertain, then that's an area where we should be looking. But I guess it comes back to the values. You are struggling with what's the common currency in terms of values, one of conservation and protecting biodiversity. There is a consequence to economics and social benefits from the system. I think it's a healthy discussion to consider how more realistic you can make the model, but you're still down to some choices about what are the key indicators. And one is I have not heard a criticism about, other than the details about where the benchmark should be, is the trade-off that considers what's an acceptable frequency with which you would fall below a particular benchmark. So that's a very explicit performance indicator, is the number of times, in this case over 50 years or so, that the indicator falls below the benchmark. If you want to weight that with some more balanced economic, or at least some method that takes advantage of the current thinking about managing economics, then I'm for that. But I still think it's the trade-offs. The trade-offs are, in my mind, I think are pretty clear. It's conservation and biodiversity versus harvest in an uncertain world. So, and maybe part of the problem is, or one of the issues is, stretching this out for 48 years in this case, and knowing that the world is going to change fairly dramatically over that time. But I mean, it gets back to the original intention of this process, and Mike has brought it out a few times, which is trying to come up with the best set of alternatives that meet the objectives of the community and stakeholders and user groups at large. And so that's to me where the search could it needs, but perhaps fleshed out with a better way to include socioeconomic indicators or considerations.
The wild salmon policy says that we need to maintain existing diversity. Has there been any discussion or evaluation by the department as to how much biodiversity is required to maintain a long-term sustainability of Fraser River sockeye?
The wild salmon policy, in words at least, its articulation is to maintain and recover. So there's a bit of a line in the sand there. If you cut down to the nuts and bolts, I suppose, if you're looking at trade-offs between human impacts, harvest for example, and the percent loss of CUs within that are vulnerable to a fishery, then for Fraser sockeye, I'm not sure that analysis has been done. It's been done elsewhere. But I think that, whether it's been done or not, the wild salmon policy is fairly explicit about maintaining biodiversity, with the off-ramp, of course, that depending on how a particular case-by-case basis, how a particular CU, if its status is poor, then it's unclear. There needs to be an evaluation of then what happens. What would that trigger, if anything?
I guess I'm not certain it's a tension between biodiversity and sustainable fisheries. I think sustainable fisheries require a degree of biodiversity. I think that's. But your question is how much of a degree? I think again, going back to my experience, people that I've worked with throughout the watershed who are in many of the communities exist and reside on the CUs, and not by accident do they live on those areas. They're there because of the fish, and perhaps they argue the fish are there because of them. But that maintaining sustainable fisheries requires maintaining their fishery, and where they are accustomed to practicing it. So diversity also and sustainable fisheries are one and the same to them.
I just want to go back to one point. We talked before about the stationarity concept, and I just want to put it to the panel. If the past isn't necessarily a good indicator of what might happen in the future, and we don't know what the future will hold, what else can we look at to make planning decisions except the past, however imperfect the past may be? And I start with you, Mr. Wilson.
Well, I suppose one of the things we can use to manage our affairs is the present. I think we all agree that in-season management, because it can account for the actual returns and not just projected returns, is the key to successful fisheries management. Having said that, though, I think it's helpful to make as few assumptions as you have to, the minimum number of assumptions you have to make about the future. Guarding against surprise is a serious matter for resource managers. We expect surprise. There are things outside the model that are unquantified and unconsidered in the model that all affect the population dynamics of Fraser sockeye. To me, the key to success is placing fish on the spawning grounds. It's as simple as that. We need to maximize diversity and abundance going forward, in the hope that by sustaining these populations and maintaining weaker stocks that may not always be weak, that over the long term we'll receive the maximum benefit. I don't think you need to speculate a great deal about the future. You can just deal with the present. But certainly if you've got steady declines in productivity, there should be a huge note of caution in the way you manage, because there's a message in the data in the past. I think Mike said it best. We have to learn from the past, but we have to live our lives going forward.
Mr. Staley, do you work with First Nations in understanding, in helping to communicate the FRSSI model outcomes to them, is that right?
One of the elements of my work plan with the Aboriginal Secretariat is following the FRSSI process, and where possible trying to communicate it, yes.
And do you think that the people you're working with have an understanding or able to understand the details of the FRSSI model in a way that allows them to make informed decisions?
I'd have to say yes to both of those, but we haven't found out how to do it yet.
Sorry, can you explain that?
Well, it's both. I think they're able to, and that they can. That's the optimist in me, in the sense they can. The reason I don't think that they have yet is because those of us who are supposed to do that haven't figured out how to do it yet in a way that is meaningful to them. And there's a whole series of there probably are a whole series of reasons why that's the case. I don't know if you want me to get into those in detail, but I'd say in general that I think they can. They're certainly capable of understanding the complexity and the a lot of the nuances that are present in a construct like the FRSSI, and I'm hopeful it can be done. We just haven't done it yet.
So are you satisfied then in the work that you're doing that the people you're communicating with are able to provide meaningful advice to the department on options and decision making that is being required through the options developed through the FRSSI model?
I have to say on balance, not yet, no.
And for the rest of the panel as well, do the different sectors that are being asked to respond to options created by the FRSSI model, do they have the capacity to understand and evaluate the impacts to them of decisions that are to be made based on the options developed? Mr. Wilson?
I think our primary concern, speaking now as the sort of from the perspective of the Marine Conservation Caucus, the analogy I use is a bus, right? The FRSSI process is going somewhere, and we understood at the time that we were involved in it that the bus was not going where we wanted to go, and we didn't really want to take responsibility for the decisions that were being made, nor did we have any confidence that changes were going to be made to the process that would make that process work for us. So we disengaged from the process. You know, it's an expensive thing to be involved in. I think there's a danger in replacing an extremely complicated reality with an extremely complicated model. If the model's going to help us make decisions, then we all have to understand the model, not just in its broad sweep, but in the specifics. We have to understand that the devil's in the details and in the little assumptions and the little errors in the data. It's entirely possible that the model behaves in a way that's quite different than we expect, and perhaps different than we understand. So I think as a tool for helping us reach a consensus about what values to express through our management approach and coming up with rules to make those trade-offs, the FRSSI process has a long way to go. Some of it's going to be a change in the way we express our interest in the model, describe the model so that it's accessible to people with sort of ordinary interests that aren't specialists or scientists. So we have a job to do in simplifying the models in a way that makes them most useful as a tool for communicating. And at the same time, we also have to develop a group of people that are well enough informed about the model to actually understand how it might affect their interests. I don't think we're there yet.
Mr. Morley, what about the commercial sector? Do you think that the commercial sector has the capacity to understand the models and understand and make informed decisions in response to the options presented by the models?
I think the commercial sector unfortunately suffers from not having the technical backup and capacity in terms of having scientific staff that are available and work for them on a regular basis to understand all the ins and outs of the model by any means whatsoever. We don't have the kind of capacity support that First Nations are getting through AFS kind of agreements, and we certainly, and from the Marine Conservation Caucus, certainly the background of many of the members there are in fact biologists and scientists and probably understand the technical aspects better than many of the people on the commercial side. So certainly I'd say that from the scientific capacity point of view, we lack that. Some of the people obviously are very intelligent and are smart enough to understand it, given the exposure to it. Not enough of them have been exposed directly to the inner workings of the model to fully understand what's going on in there. I think that most people only understand the outputs from the model, which has meant very low expectation rates and too many fish going up to the spawning grounds, and have seen lack of commercial fishery as a result of the application of this. So we certainly understand the outcomes from the model, but we don't really understand particularly well how it's put together and whether or not it reflects our values properly.
Do you, and this is a question for the panel, do you think that the sectors need to understand to a high level how this model works? Do you need to have the scientific background in order to use the outputs, or can the department who provides the expertise simply explain the outputs to the sectors and in a way that would allow the sectors to understand the outputs? We don't have to know how to create an MRI machine to listen to our doctor interpret the results. Is it the same thing here, that the model is maybe complex, but maybe sectors don't need to know how it all works? They can simply have the outputs explained to them by scientists who do understand it. I'll start with you, Mr. Morley, seeing as we've talked with you.
I think that's a little different here because, in fact, the model purports to incorporate some of the sector's values in terms of how it is evaluating different escapement strategies. And so really people need to understand how their values are being incorporated and whether they're being represented properly in order to be comfortable working with the outputs. And frankly, I know I personally don't feel comfortable with the way the model is incorporating commercial values when it talks about, quote, a scenario that avoids low catch. Okay, that's not all I'm interested in terms of yield from the fishery. So certainly I'm more in tune with maximizing some kind of benefit rather than just avoiding a minimum low level. So so I do believe that given what the model is purporting to try to do, which is to, quote, optimize this strategy, that people need to be much more involved in how it's put together and whether or not it does, help us to reflect and model what people really want.
Mr. Wilson?
Well, to follow your analogy, I don't think I need to understand how an MRI works, but I'd sure like to know that someone did. And of course, my doctor, I would hope, would have only my best interests at heart. So in that sense, I should be able to rely on him to provide me with good, impartial advice. On the other hand, if MRIs could give you cancer as well as detect it, you might take a very different approach to how you use that tool. Right? It's a tool. And it's a tool that's supposed to help us make decisions and trade-offs. And I think if we're the ones using the tool, as your doctor is using an MRI, then I think there is some positive obligation on the part of the person using the tool to understand the tool. Otherwise, it becomes one more black box, and it leaves everyone not only abdicating their responsibility to manage the resource in a way that's best for all of us, but it also leaves us open to manipulation, because we take the model output at face value, because we don't understand how the model works, and we accept that the model can do what we can't, and that's navigate through a complex set of trade-offs and tell us what to do. But to me, all we're really doing is trying to frame what is a political problem, balancing people's values and interests, and trying to reframe it as a technical problem so that science gives us the answer.
Mr. Staley?
what to say after that. I think that Rob sort of hit it on nail on the head. I think it needs to, the people who, in order for someone to trust the doctor, they have to be sure, as Ken said, that the doctor has their interests. And if it's not really transparent how their interests are being expressed and dealt with in the process, then it's difficult for them to trust anybody, including people who work for them, to explain how the model works or how it doesn't work. And so it's, I think there's a threshold of trust that we, in this, particularly for First Nation, which is a big one that's probably, it's generations old, so it's not something perhaps we can all solve today. But it's there as a trust issue, and until we get over, or addressed a little bit over the trust issue about whether the interests and values are being honored appropriately, they're going to have difficulty with the technical, listening to people like me talk about technical stuff.
Right, Mr. Cass, maybe we'll just end with you if you've got any response to some of those statements.
Yeah, I mean, from the outset,
Microphone, please.
From the outset, Mr. Commissioner, I don't think we've said that this is the perfect tool, but I guess I would flip it around. That here's a process, as Ken's described, as a bus, and it has some elements of consistent framework, if you want to call it that, for evaluating trade-offs. And yes, there's a complexity there that if you're not close to it, you're not going to understand the nuts and bolts and the details and what it's spitting out. So this bus, I guess, is has, I guess, I learned a lot over time about what's worked and what hasn't worked. But I would sort of maybe flip it back to the people who perhaps have the most at stake here, and they have to live with something like this that is going to be a guide about how you make decisions and how you wrestle with different values that different sectors have. What are the steps? I guess so. We've heard a few variants of these. Include better socioeconomic, a better socioeconomic framework for that is used to assess performance of the economics. How do we assess values of, right down to the nitty-gritty? How do you assess values of the different sectors? But I would ask, my colleagues here, what would they see as a next step to fix some of the problems? I guess Mike has mentioned trust, which is an issue, a clear issue. If you don't understand how something works, then how are you ever going to trust it? The hard part here is, anybody with the kind of background in the tech, being a technician to develop a model, anybody can develop a model. You put the pieces together and it has an output. Where we've come in the last 10, 15 years, I think, is more of an acceptance that that's probably not the best way to proceed in terms, and especially when there are competing trade-offs or there's a need to search for common ground. Because the hard part is trying to engage. It's trying to bring people to the table to inform the details, to learn and to gain trust. So, over 8 years or whatever it is that this thing has been on the road, and a dozen or so workshops, we're left in a situation where there appears to be some clear issues related to what is this thing called FRSSI supposed to be doing, and how does it bring together the various interests of the different stakeholders and be useful and guide in terms of some long-term strategy for management. The people engagement is in my mind the difficult issue, and it is costly, and it takes up an inordinate amount of people's time.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, if you'd like to take the break now, I'll try and be very quick when we get back, or we can keep going, whichever you prefer.
We're now recessed for 15 minutes. sorry, 10.